a king walks into a stone dungeon where his enemies have been held prisoner for days. Men from one of the single most powerful noble families in his entire kingdom. He tells them, personally and directly, that he forgives them completely. That the conspiracy charges against them are finished. That they have nothing left to fear from him ever again. A few hours later, that same king comes back into that same cell and stabs one of them himself with his own hands. This wasn't a trick planned carefully in advance, some elaborate scheme designed to lower his prisoner's guard before striking them down. Something changed dramatically in those few short hours. Something violent and sudden inside the mind of a king who had already been teetering on the edge for a very long time. His name was Erik the 14th of Sweden. Afterward, he vanished into a forest for 2 days, and when he was finally found, he seemed genuinely unable to explain what he had just done. This is the true story of a king's paranoia, a massacre remembered as the Sture murders, and the 6 months of madness that followed it. To understand how Erik got to that dungeon door, you have to understand the pressure he had been living under for years. Erik was born in 1533, the eldest son of Gustav Vasa, the king who had founded Sweden's ruling dynasty from almost nothing and secured the country's full independence from its neighbors a generation earlier through years of war and careful, ruthless political maneuvering. Erik became king of Sweden himself in 1560, inheriting both a throne and an enormous, difficult legacy to live up to from a father widely remembered as strong, decisive, and utterly uncompromising. His reign was tested almost immediately. Sweden was locked in the costly, grinding Northern 7 Years' War against Denmark, an old rival, a conflict that drained the royal treasury year after year and demanded constant military attention that left little room for anything else. On top of the war, Erik faced a different, quieter, but equally corrosive kind of pressure. Despite fathering several children outside of marriage, he had no legitimate heir at all, which left the long-term future of his own bloodline and his own personal claim to the throne looking uncomfortably fragile in the eyes of Sweden's watching nobility. Between the endless demands of the war and the quiet anxiety of the succession problem, Erik grew increasingly suspicious of nearly everyone around him, especially Sweden's powerful old noble families, precisely the people who possessed the wealth, the private soldiers, and the deep-rooted bloodlines needed to actually challenge a king if they ever decided the moment was right. That suspicion didn't stay abstract for long. It found a very specific target. Erik became fixated, almost obsessively, on a young nobleman named Nils Sture, a member of one of the single most influential and well-connected families in the entire kingdom, with a lineage stretching back through generations of Swedish political power. Erik came to see Nils as a genuine, credible rival for the throne itself, whether or not Nils had personally ever actually entertained any such ambitions, and there is little solid evidence that he had. In Erik's mind, by this point, the mere possibility was already dangerous enough to act on. In May of 1567, Erik had Nils Sture arrested, along with several other members of the extended Sture family and their close political associates, all charged formally with conspiracy against the crown, an accusation that, at this point in Erik's reign, could be leveled against almost anyone who drew his suspicion. They were imprisoned together at Uppsala Castle, held in a cold stone chamber under armed guard, with no clear timeline for a trial, awaiting whatever judgment the king eventually decided to hand down. For days, their fate hung entirely on the shifting moods of an increasingly unstable monarch. Then, on May the 24th, something appeared to change. Erik personally visited the imprisoned nobles in their cell, without guards forcing the meeting, seemingly of his own free will. According to the accounts that survive from the period, he told them directly and plainly that they were forgiven, that the conspiracy charges were being set aside entirely, and that they had nothing left to fear from him going forward. For a brief window that afternoon, it must genuinely have looked to these men like they were actually going to survive their imprisonment after all, that the worst was finally behind them. Then Erik left the cell and almost immediately received devastating, unwelcome news. An active rebellion was underway, led by his own half-brother, Duke John, a rival with a real claim and real armed support behind him. Whatever fragile calm Erik had reached with his prisoners collapsed instantly under this new information. His paranoia, which had briefly, genuinely quieted just that morning, came roaring back stronger than ever, and this time it fused directly and irrationally with the very men he had just personally reassured only hours earlier, as though their forgiveness and his brother's rebellion were somehow one single connected thread. A few hours after promising forgiveness, Erik returned to the cell where the Sture family and their associates were being held. He was not the same man who had visited that morning. This time, Erik personally stabbed Nils Sture, the young nobleman he had fixated on for months, with his own hands. What followed has come to be known in Swedish history as the Sture murders. Erik's own royal guards then killed several of the remaining prisoners on the spot, one after another. Nils's own father, the elder statesman Svante Sture, his brother Erik Sture, the nobleman Abraham Stenbock, and a man named Ivar Liljorn, none of them given any real chance to defend themselves against charges that had supposedly just been forgiven that same morning. Even Erik's own former childhood tutor, a man named Dionysius Burius, someone who had known and cared for Erik since he was a boy, was killed that same day, cut down while physically trying to restrain the king and stop the killing from continuing any further. In the span of a single afternoon, a gesture of forgiveness had turned into the killing of 5 men, one of them by the king's own hand, and another while trying to save him from himself. What Erik did immediately afterward is almost as strange as the killings themselves. He fled the castle entirely, alone, and disappeared into a nearby forest. For 2 full days, the King of Sweden, ruler of the entire country, was simply missing, with no one at court quite sure where he had gone or what state he was actually in. Courtiers searched desperately in every direction, both to physically find him and to keep the full, ugly scale of what had happened from spreading any further than it already inevitably had. When Erik was finally found, in the small village of Odensala, he was dressed as a peasant, disoriented, and by most accounts genuinely unable to clearly explain or fully process what he had just done back at Uppsala Castle. This wasn't performance, and it doesn't appear to have been any kind of clever, calculated attempt to dodge responsibility for what he'd done. Erik remained in a documented, sustained state of serious mental breakdown for roughly the next 6 months, completely unable to function as a king, or in some accounts, even fully as himself. During that entire difficult period, he was cared for closely by Karin Mansdotter, a commoner and former serving woman who had already become his mistress some time before. She stayed by his side through the very worst of it, at a moment when almost no one else remaining at court seemed willing to. When Erik eventually recovered enough to resume ruling, he made a decision that scandalized the Swedish nobility almost as much as the murders themselves. He married Karin Mansdotter, the commoner who had nursed him personally through his breakdown. An extraordinary and deeply controversial choice for a reigning Swedish king to make in this period, when marriages at this level were normally arranged entirely for political and dynastic advantage. She was eventually crowned queen alongside him regardless, formally elevating a former servant to the highest position a woman could hold in the kingdom. But recovering from a personal breakdown didn't automatically mean recovering the trust of an entire kingdom. Sweden's nobility had watched their own king forgive imprisoned enemies, then personally help murder one of them within hours, followed immediately by a very public, very visible breakdown lasting half a year. That kind of trust, once broken this badly, never really came back at all. In 1568, barely a year after the Sture murders, Erik's own 2 half-brothers, Duke John and Duke Charles, joined forces and led a successful, well-organized rebellion against him, one that met remarkably little resistance from a nobility that had already lost all faith in their king. Erik was formally deposed, stripped entirely of his throne and his royal title, and taken into custody by the very same family members whose earlier rebellion had directly triggered his final, catastrophic break at Uppsala Castle in the first place. He spent nearly a decade afterward as a prisoner of his own former kingdom, moved repeatedly between a series of different remote castles under constant armed guard, completely and permanently cut off from the throne and the power he had once held so absolutely. Erik died in 1577 at Årbyhus Castle, still a prisoner after nearly a decade in captivity. Modern forensic testing of his exhumed remains, conducted centuries later using techniques unimaginable in his own lifetime, found abnormally high levels of arsenic in his body, leading many historians to conclude he was deliberately poisoned, most likely on the orders of his own brother, King John III, the same brother whose earlier rebellion had unraveled everything back in that dungeon in 1567. So what does the strange, brutal story of Erik XIV actually leave behind? A king whose unchecked, years-long paranoia turned a single afternoon of genuine reconciliation into a brutal massacre, followed almost immediately by a total collapse of his own mind, and ultimately the complete, permanent loss of his throne, his freedom, and very possibly his life as well. Unchecked paranoia in a position of real, absolute power rarely stays contained to just the specific people it happens to be aimed at in any given moment. Erik's fear of losing his throne became the very reason he eventually lost it, and once trust is shattered as completely and as publicly as it was that single afternoon at Uppsala Castle, no amount of forgiveness offered afterward, however sincere, can ever fully put it back together again.